Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk about whether meditation lowers cortisol levels and also how you can know whether you're in the group that could get a benefit or not. Stay tuned. Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters, and these are resources to help you thrive. So in this video, I want to talk about whether or not meditation lowers cortisol levels. And I'm going to talk about what cortisol is, what meditation has been studied, and some of the findings from a meta-analysis that was published in the Health Psychology Review in 2021 that shed some interesting light on this question. So first, let me talk about what cortisol is and why this matters to us. So cortisol is a hormone that is released in your body regularly, even when you're not stressed. You and I, everybody on the planet, has cortisol released into our system, and it follows a daily pattern. So typically, you have your highest cortisol levels after you wake up in the morning, and then it steadily declines during the day, and it's at the lowest at night when you are sleeping. One way to think about cortisol is you could think about it as kind of an energy boost. So when you get up in the morning and once you're fully awake and you have your on mode, that feeling of on, the ability to be in the activated state where you can have more efficient focus and more productive activities, that is influenced by your cortisol levels, right? Which is also why later in the day, when you get progressively more tired, your activation level progressively comes down, 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 and then hopefully is low enough that you get restful sleep. However, people have been studying cortisol for a very long time. Typically, they study it by just taking a blood test or doing a swab in someone's mouth to try to get the cortisol levels. Sometimes they also measure cortisol levels in the hair. But what we know is that cortisol can get dysregulated. And dysregulated typically means, for most concerns, that it's too high. So you want it to be optimally high in the early part of your day, progressively decline over your day, and be at its lowest point when you're asleep. But for a lot of people, when cortisol gets dysregulated, it's too high all of the time. And this is a hormone that's implicated in manifestations such as panic attacks, generalized anxiety, acute anxiety episodes when you're awake, or having trouble falling asleep, having trouble staying asleep, waking up too early before you intend to wake up and not being able to get back asleep. And also with some people saying they wake up already anxious or already worrying about things. And for some people, even waking up in the middle of a frank panic attack. Okay. So cortisol is implicated with a lot of those symptoms. Cortisol is also associated with a lot of physical health issues such as type 2 diabetes and immune system dysregulation and other health issues. And it's also correlated with mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. And you also see it in people with chronic stress from low socioeconomic status, people with chronic health conditions like PCOS. Now, we don't know with a lot of the research that's looked at it necessarily that it's causal, that high cortisol causes this or this causes high cortisol. We just know that it's associated, right? Now, there is theory and there is the idea that elevated cortisol levels can be causative of negative physical health issues, right? Now, if you want to study the effects of cortisol and how it puts people at risk in these types of associations, you could just go Google cortisol and health or cortisol and physical health issues or cortisol and stress. And there's quite a bit of discussion because it's something that's been studied for many decades. But in general, our thinking about cortisol is that we want to do things that help to regulate cortisol into that optimal zone. So we don't want it to be too high when it doesn't need to be above a certain threshold. We don't want it to be too low either, right? And this is one of the reasons that I've seen some discussion of supplements that lower cortisol, such as a popular one is ashwagandha that people take. Ashwagandha is effective to lower stress. It's an adaptogen and it does lower cortisol levels. But for some people who don't have dysregulated cortisol, if you're taking ashwagandha, one potential outcome is that you lower your cortisol level even lower than you want it to be. So you're less activated than you ideally want to be in the time of the day when you actually want to be on, right? So that could be an issue. And if you want to study that, just Google ashwagandha and cortisol levels, and you can see discussion of that on the internet. But in general, here's the bottom line. The so what about cortisol is that while it's natural, it gets pumped out. We know that it gets released in larger quantities when someone is experiencing acute stress. So if you have a car pull out in front of you and you almost hit it or you hit it, one of the things that's going to happen in your body is you're going to release cortisol. But we also know that it is released in chronic stress. So if you've got an ongoing situation that is causing you ongoing stress, we know for certain that you're going to have elevated cortisol levels. It's highly associated with chronic stress of a lot of different types. And so some of the things that we do, and by we, I mean people like me who are therapists who help people lower their anxiety and stress and ameliorate depression and don't prescribe medicines and aren't dietitians or people who necessarily get too involved in supplements, right? So some people like me are going to teach people things that we know can be effective to lower cortisol, right? So that you can be optimally regulated in your cortisol levels, and also so that to the extent that cortisol is implicated in actually causing problems for us, it's going to lower that risk, right? So ideally, the goal is to have optimal cortisol levels that are not too high and not too low. So I was looking at a study recently that was published in the Health Psychology Review in 2021, which was a meta-analysis that looked into 21 different studies that had looked at the connection between the practice of meditation and cortisol levels. And let me just explain what a meta-analysis is. So when people do research, let's say you define, I want to study this and how it relates to that, and you design your methods for your research and you go collect your data through the actual research project, and then you analyze the data. Then what people do is that they publish the findings of that research study in peer-reviewed journals. And sometimes those shed very good light on a particular question about whatever's being studied. But there's another way to get at questions, and that is to do a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is not a primary research study where they go out and actually measure something and collect the data, but where they actually filter research articles that have already been published on the topic that are measuring the variables that you want to look at. And they look at the methods to make sure that the methods are rigorous and so that they can trust that the findings were valid, because you don't just include any study. Some studies are included in peer-reviewed journals where the methods are questionable or controversial, and you can't really trust them as highly as you would want to. So what people do when they do a meta-analysis is they look at the methods first of the studies that fit into their category of the variables they want to study, and they say, do those findings seem to be based on good methods? And then they only include in their analysis studies that meet certain criteria about rigorous methods. So this particular article that was published in the journal in 2021, I'll put the link in the description, by the way. If you want to go read the full text of that article, I'll just stick the link down in the description. But basically what they did was they used those filters and they came up with 21 different studies that they thought had valid findings that were looking at the question of the relationship between the practice of meditation and cortisol levels, right? And so the short of it is that they actually found that these all 21 studies did show a correlation. They showed different degrees of correlation, but basically they found that when people practiced meditation, that it did result in lower cortisol levels. And what they were looking at were studies that basically had asked people to learn meditation and to practice it. And then they measured the cortisol levels, at the beginning of the study before they had done the practice, and then they measured it again at the end. And some of the studies also measured at different intervals after the end of the study. So trying to get an additional question, which is, if it lowers cortisol, does it continue giving that beneficial effect even after the practice is assumed to have waned or even stopped? So these studies were looking at an accumulated total amount of practice between about 12 to 20 total hours of practice. So in terms of the methods of the study, what they did was they looked at people who learned a method and then during the study actually performed it X amount of time. And so that was variable across the studies. Not all of them taught the same meditation method, but most of the studies were actually teaching a form of mindfulness meditation, which is the form that I tend to teach in my practice as well. So there are lots of different types of meditation. There's mindfulness meditation. There's a closely related one called Vipassana. There's Zen meditation, which is also pretty closely related to mindfulness. But there are other forms of meditation as well, some of which have been studied. And the study that I'm talking about actually did look at studies that taught a different type of meditation, which was transcendental meditation, which got popular in the West back in the 1970s. Interestingly, the studies that looked at transcendental meditation did not show as big or a significant decrease in cortisol levels compared with mindfulness meditation. It seemed that the mindfulness meditation practitioners enjoyed more of that benefit of lowered cortisol levels. So another interesting finding when they looked at the data across these 21 studies was that the people who got the most benefit of lowered cortisol levels were people who were in situations of stress. So people who were experiencing grief, people with low socioeconomic status, people with chronic health conditions. So one way to measure that, which was used in some of the studies that they collected into this meta-analysis, is perceived stress. So you can infer that someone is stressed if you know that they're going through what you would assume is a challenging life event, like losing a close loved one and experiencing grief. But in the studies that look at perceived stress, often what they do is they give a stress scale and they have people rate their subjective perceived stress level. So what they found in looking at the data across the 21 studies is that for people who had high perceived stress, regardless of the actual stressor that they were experiencing, those people enjoyed a very significant regulation and lowering of their cortisol levels. For people who reported very low perceived stress in their life and participated in the meditation studies, they had a change in cortisol, but not a significant one, right? Now, I interpret this personally as good news, which means that if you have low stress in your life and your cortisol levels are well regulated, so they're not dysregulated and too high or too low, meditation is going to provide benefits, but it's not going to then further dysregulate your cortisol levels. And that was the issue that I was pointing to when I talked about ashwagandha. If you have low levels of stress and you take ashwagandha, ashwagandha is still going to lower your cortisol levels, right? So it might actually dysregulate it too low. but meditation doesn't seem to dysregulate it too low, at least in the data as I interpret it, as reported in this meta-analysis. So if you have low perceived stress and you meditate, it's not going to throw your cortisol levels out of whack. But if you have high perceived stress, then the practice of meditation is shown to lower and regulate your cortisol levels back into the normal range. And I would expect that that would mean, in terms of your actual experience, that would mean that it would reduce the negative symptoms that come from elevated cortisol levels. And in fact, I see this in my practice. I've been practicing as a mindfulness-based cognitive therapist for 26 years. I've shared different types of stress management and meditation techniques with thousands of people. And I consistently, regularly, to this day, see people get very quick beneficial results in terms of the subjective phenomena that people experience that we correlate to stress. So when people are having panic attacks, acute anxiety, mood dysregulation, poor sleep, what I've found is that when I teach people very simple, easy to learn, easy to practice techniques to lower stress, you see the lowering of these manifestations that we attribute to higher cortisol levels, right? So if you're interested in learning more about those techniques, I have a 2-week course that teaches these techniques to help you lower cortisol. It's the Stress Reduction Mastery course. I'll put a link for that down in the description as well. If you want to learn how to do mindfulness meditation, I have a free video on this channel, and I'll put a link up here right now if you want to go check that out. But very easy to learn, super easy. And it doesn't really take that long to accumulate enough practice to get the positive benefits. I know that these studies were looking at, a range of practice of like 15 to 20 hours total before they were, doing the final measurement of the lowered cortisol. But I will tell you that in my practice, when I teach someone how to do mindful meditation and they do it as I prescribe, which is 5 1-minute sessions every single day, usually in about a week to 10 days, people have very significant positive results that I would infer mean that their cortisol levels are lower. So if you're doing 5 minutes a day in 1 week, you've only accumulated 35 total minutes of practice. So in my experience, under an hour of total practice already starts conferring that benefit, right? So anyway, check out the link. I'll also put the link to that video in the description below if you just want to look down there to get the how-to video in terms of how to practice mindful meditation. And you can check that out. So if you like this kind of content, hit the like button below, please. If you have yet to subscribe, please subscribe to the channel. And I know your time is valuable, and I appreciate you joining me with this video today. So please keep apprised of the channel, because I will continue making videos on topics related to stress reduction and therapy. So I'll see you in a future video. Thanks.